Words of our Lord Sri Aurobindo from the book Letters on Yoga Part 1 from the Collective Works of Sri Aurobindo Volume 28, page 71, topic the Jivatman in Other Indian Systems. Point 4, which is a continuation of yesterday's discussion. Sri Aurobindo says in this fourth point, one may ask first, why not then say that the Jivatman, which can be realized in this way, is the pure I of which the lower self has the experience and through which it gets its salvation? And secondly, what need is there of going into the overhead planes at all? Well, in the first place, this pure I does not seem to be an absolutely necessary as an intermediary of the liberation, whether into the impersonal self or Brahman or into whatever is eternal. The Buddhists do not admit any soul or self or any experience of the pure I. Proceed by dissolving the consciousness into a bundle of samskaras, getting rid of the samskaras, and so are liberated into some permanent which they refuse to describe or some shunya. Sri Aurobindo says, so the experience of a pure I or Jivatman is not binding on everyone who wants liberation into the eternal, but is content to get it without rising beyond the spiritualized mind into a higher light above. I myself had my experience of nirvana and silence in the Brahman, etc., long before there was any knowledge of the overhead spiritual planes. It came first simply by an absolute stillness and blotting out, as it were, of all mental, emotional, and other inner activities. The body continued indeed to see, walk, speak, and do its other business, but as an empty automatic machine and nothing more. I did not become aware of any pure I, says Sri Aurobindo. I did not become aware of any pure I, nor even of any self, impersonal or other. There was only an awareness of that as the sole reality, all else being quite unsubstantial, void, non-real. As to what realized that reality, it was a nameless consciousness which was not other than that. He gives a footnote here which says, mark that I did not think these things. They were no thoughts or concepts, nor did they present themselves like that to any me. It simply just was so, or was self-apparently so. One could perhaps say this, though hardly even so much as this, since there was no mental concept of it, but no more. Neither was I aware of any lower soul or outer self called by such and such a personal name that was performing this feat of arriving at the consciousness of nirvana. Well, then, what becomes of your pure I and lower I in all that? Consciousness, not this or that part of consciousness or an I of any kind, suddenly emptied itself of all inner contents and remained aware only of unreal surroundings and of something real but ineffable. You may say that they must have been a consciousness aware of some perceiving existence, if not of a pure I. But if so, it was something for which these names seem inadequate. Fifth point by our Lord, Sri Aurobindo says, I have said the overhead ascension is not indispensable for the usual spiritual purposes, but it is indispensable for the purposes of this yoga. For its aim is to become aware of and liberate and transform and unite all the being in the light of a truth consciousness which is above and cannot be reached if there is no entirely inward going and no transcending and upward going movement. Hence, all the complexity of my psychological statements as a whole, not new in essence, for much of it occurs in the Upanishads and elsewhere, but new in its fullness of complete statement and its development directed towards an integral yoga. It is not necessary for anyone to accept it unless he conquers in the aim. For other aims, it is unnecessary and may very well be excessive. Sixth point. But when one has made the inner exploration and the ascension, when one's consciousness is located above, one cannot be expected to see things precisely as they are seen from below. The Jivatman is for me the unborn who presides over the individual being and its development associated with it, but above it and them, and who by the very nature of his existence knows himself as universal and transcendent, no less than individual, and feels the divine to be his origin, the truth of his being, the master of his nature, the very stuff of his existence. Sri Aurobindo says he is plunged in the divine and one with the eternal forever, aware of his own expression and instrumental dynamism, which is the divine's, dependent in love and delight with adoration on that with which yet through that love and delight he is one, capable of relation and oneness, harmonic in this many-sidedness without contradiction, because this is another consciousness and existence than that of the mind, even of the spiritualized mind. It is an intrinsic consciousness of the infinite, infinite not only in essence but in capacity, which can be to its own self-awareness all things and yet forever the same and one. This triune realization, therefore, full of difficulties for the mind, is quite natural, easy, indisputable to the supramental consciousness or generally to the consciousness of the upper hemisphere. Sri Aurobindo continues to say, it can be seen and felt as knowledge in all the spiritual planes, but the completely indivisible knowledge, the full dynamics of it can only be realized through the supramental consciousness itself on its own plane or by its descent here. Seventh point. The description of a pure I is quite insufficient to describe the realization of the Jivatman. It is rather describable as a true person or divine individual, though that too is not adequate. The word I always comes with an under-suggestion of ego, of separativeness, but there is no separativeness in this self-vision, for the individual here is a spiritual living center of action for the one, and one feels no separation from all that is one. Eighth point. The Jivatman has its representative power in the individual nature here. This power is the Purusha, upholding the Prakriti centrally in the psychic, more instrumentally in the mind, vital and physical being and nature. It is therefore possible to regard these or any of them as if they were the Jiva here. All the same, I am obliged to make a distinction not only for clear thinking, but because of the necessity of experience and integral dynamic self-knowledge, without which it is difficult to carry through this yoga. It is not indispensable to formulate mentally to oneself all this. One can have the experience, and if one sees clearly with an inner perception, it is sufficient for progress towards the goal. Nevertheless, if the mind is clarified without falling into the mental rigidity and error, things are easier for the sadhak of the yoga. But plasticity must be preserved, for loss of plasticity is the danger of a systematic intellectual formation. But plasticity must be preserved, for loss of plasticity is the danger of a systematic intellectual formulation. One must look into the thing itself and not get tied up in the idea. Nothing of all this can be really grasped except by the actual spiritual experience. These are the words of our Lord Sri Aurobindo.